When I was 14, a major exhibition of 350 pieces of rare Islamic art spanning across 13 centuries came to Australia. So of course, my art teacher mother determined there was no activity that would be more fun for her 11 and 14-year-old children to do while on school holidays than to learn about the history of Islamic art. And we all went to the exhibition, and it was beautiful. But the only specific part I really remember from that day was looking along a row of marvellous ink and watercolour paintings, all illuminated in gold and silver, then stopping on one illustration in the series with shimmering fish swimming in a detailed churning sea and a boat full of people travelling above. Lucky my mum still has the exhibition catalogue, so I can actually show you exactly what it looked like. Maybe on the slide. Amazing. I thought it was stunning, but when I looked at the notation next to it, I remember being a bit taken aback. The label for this artwork read, Iran 1314 to 15 AD, Noah's Ark. Looking back, I think some of my surprise at finding a depiction of Noah's Ark in an Islamic art exhibition came from the fact that 14-year-old me was at the time attending a church that leaned towards the more conservative side of things, and let's just say exploring the intersection of shared stories across Islamic and Christian traditions wasn't really encouraged as part of the youth group agenda. I suspect, though, this was in fact exactly the agenda my mother had had in mind. Coming to this passage today, though, I find in a very different way to when I was 14, I'm still sort of puzzled by this crossover. When Christians so often love to talk about how we're not like other religions, when even within Christianity, we love to point out how our nuanced views differ to other Christian traditions, how is Noah's Ark the bit we seem to agree on? A ridiculous amount of animals on a boat? Sure, we'll take that part too. Worldwide flood there's no geological evidence for, doesn't seem too controversial. Oh, the bit about God killing off pretty much everyone in the world, yep, seems we can get on board with that part. It seems to be a story where, at least on surface level, many are comfortable just leaving it at a slightly ill-fitting literal interpretation. For example, we have a wooden Noah's Ark toy that my cousin's toddlers play with when they visit. And as I'm sure you're not surprised to hear, the animals are a real focus. After all, everyone loves fun animals. There are wooden cows and wooden pigs, and there are also wooden giraffes and wooden crocodiles, and a pair of wooden koalas. Did the koalas just pop over to modern-day Armenia for the event when they heard the crocodiles had the cruise tickets? And sure, I guess it's not that surprising when we understand what we understand today about how geographic isolation has influenced evolution, or that more than 95% of species are invertebrates, or that a quick Google search will tell you there are over 350,000 types of beetles, that we do run into some challenges with how we represent this story in the format of a wooden children's toy. But it's an epic story. And I don't want to take away all the fun of wooden koalas. So maybe the solution is just to try and make Noah's Ark toys not perfect, but a bit more accurate. Check what types of animals were likely to have been in the area at the time. Add in the right number of little wooden characters for Noah and his family. Don't forget a little wooden dove and the raven and all the drowned animals or the dead wet birds. How many wooden figures should we include for all of humanity that gets blotted out? It's not the koalas that bother me about the way this story can be interpreted. It's this intervening, direct, sort of a logical type of God that is painted, picking specific good people, willing to wipe out masses of bad people, carefully orchestrating worldwide disaster. And the more you look at this story, the more problems there seem to be. It makes me start to question what type of God has gone and created all this? What kind of God are we really dealing with here? And then I wonder, so early in the creation narrative of humanity, if this is not the exact question the story is intended to make us ask. If we stop looking at this story's purpose as a story which recounts any sort of literal events, and start looking at it as a story which is trying to introduce us to some of the questions people tend to have about the concept of a God, I think it starts to become a bit more useful. And more broadly, Genesis can be seen as a book that introduces us to some of the big questions. The creation stories prompt us to ask, how do we get here? Adam and Eve start to explore why are people the way they are, and then Noah's Ark introduces us to the next natural question. How does God interact with this world? The problems in the story I pointed out earlier are really all just classic questions and enduring mysteries we still have today about the nature of what we might understand God to be. Does God intervene in our lives? What does God control in the natural world? Wouldn't God regret making humans when we can be so harmful? There's something I like about a religious text that seems to acknowledge these big questions up front in some of its most enduring and iconic content. That said, I'm not sure Noah's Ark tries to give us all the answers. It's definitely a dramatic epic of a story in its own right, but in some ways, I see it more like a teaser trailer for all the questions you'll likely have to confront if you choose to further investigate a reading of reality which involves an omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient God. They're big questions, and definitely cannot all be covered in one sermon. So I want to focus us in on one question Noah's Ark raises, one which I think has particularly practical implications for each of our lives today. Is God going to suddenly make me build a big boat? Maybe you've heard this passage preached in a way that encourages us to aspire to or even identify with the character of Noah, the righteous one of his generation, obedient and chosen by God. Now, apart from the fact I think it's pretty unlikely I'm going to win most obedient of my generation, the idea of what happens to Noah in the story because of God's intervention sort of terrifies me. I reckon Noah had a nice quiet life, probably retired by the ripe old age of 500, I'd say. And then God shows up with this massive ark demand, which completely upends his life, and Noah has to prioritise boat building and animal husbandry for the next 100 years or so. The part that scares me is that if this interventionist portrayal of God is correct, what's to stop God telling me I have to start rounding up animals tomorrow? I'd rather just stick to my Monday routine of coffee, day job, and Netflix. Thank you very much, God. Even though we've established that the contents of this story may not be particularly literal, the spectrum of beliefs on divine intervention, meaning how much we each believe God is controlling what happens in our lives and in the world, can have a very literal impact on how we operate and make decisions. For example, if your beliefs veer towards the end of the divine intervention spectrum, where God can and will intervene in everything and anything, it makes it much easier to pray for a car parked. But it makes it much harder to reconcile what role God is playing in the situation when a friend tells you they've got some bad medical news. On the other hand, if your view of God's involvement veers towards the opposite end of the spectrum, where God sits back and doesn't really actively intervene with anything much, it makes it much easier to attribute horrible things we see on the news to be a result of humans' choices or chance. But it becomes much harder to see where God's presence is if nothing really seems to be working out like you hoped it would. Now, either of these positions might work pretty well for some people, but personally I'm not a big fan of either extremes. I find myself looking for some sort of middle ground that allows us to see how God is active in this world without seeing God as just ignoring everything bad happening. And here is where I think we run into a bit of a common conundrum, or maybe an assumption rather, that we can assume that the middle ground between an interventionist God and a passive God is an inconsistent God. A God that chooses to intervene sometimes, but not all the time. A God that steps in to solve your problems, but not so much yours. A God that answers your prayers one week, but is a bit apathetic next week. A God that leads some people into God's community, but doesn't choose to do that for everyone. There are Christian traditions that would say, yep, exactly right. God does do whatever he wants whenever he wants, and some people are chosen and some people are not, and that's just the way it is. God doesn't have to be consistent when he's the all-powerful ruler of the universe. I wouldn't usually use he, him pronouns when referring to God, but I do reckon that train of thinking tends to show up in some pretty uphold the patriarchy theobros type spaces. It sounds more like the way an unhinged megalomaniac operates than the merciful God I've come to know. I'd like to offer a different understanding of the middle ground for us today. I put to you for consideration that a balance between intervention and passiveness is not a God of inconsistency, but rather a God that creates opportunity. What if in between the extremes of the controlling and the uninvolved images of God, we can find a God that does not constantly manipulate our experiences, nor do they ignore our experiences, but they lovingly create us opportunities for change and growth. Maybe this God won't fix everything when your friend calls to tell you that bad news. But maybe this God will give you the opportunity to be on the other end of the phone so that your friend has someone to tell. Maybe this God isn't just sitting back and watching when things aren't panning out for you. But maybe this God is giving you the opportunity to go outside, stroll through their creation, and relax a bit as you ponder what to do next. This way of approaching God as a God of opportunity means we don't fall into the extremes of thinking that in God's eyes we are just beings to be manipulated, or that on the other hand, God sees us as largely irrelevant. Maybe God won't stop people setting up systems or entities that harm the vulnerable, but maybe God's giving us the opportunities and skills and intellect to intervene in these systems. Maybe God isn't ignoring problems like ableism and sexism and ageism. Maybe God's giving us the opportunities to build relationships with others where we can challenge these ways of thinking. As well as remembering that our God is omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-seeing, and omnipresent everywhere all at once. I believe they are also omnibenevolent, all-loving and fully merciful. And that a tendency to underestimate this aspect of God or to assume that it is surpassed by their omnipotence is a dangerous point of view. So what does this all mean for our question about if God is going to make you build a boat tomorrow? I'd say the literal boat aspect seems statistically unlikely. But the idea that if you're paying attention, you will find yourself with the opportunity to do something inspired by the divine, which disrupts, disorders, or even seemingly derails what humans have told you should be doing with your life. As scary as it might be, I strongly suspect the answer is yes. And when I look around at the people in my life seeking to follow God in this way, they're all pretty much taking up the opportunity and building some kind of Noah's Ark. Opportunities to build arks in community, an ark in the form of a safe space to march in Mardi Gras next weekend, an ark in the form of a growing Sunday school which does tell kids about God's love, not just the koalas and Noah's Ark, and opportunities to build arks for ourselves, arks of self-compassion and self-forgiveness. So whether our arks take moments or months or millennia to build, whether it's filled with animals or food pantry staples for those in need, whether it's protecting against a flood or protecting others from a flood of unjust legislation, I pray you find a sense of divine opportunity and divine love in the ark you've been called to build.